Your mom was smashing plates outside your home
Yeah.
when you came home from school. Can you explain that story and what it taught you about rage?
Sure. So I think I was 14, 15. And I got home from school, and my mom was a full-time homemaker, um, and she was home.
Mm.
And I walked into our kitchen and could see her right outside the kitchen on a terrace that was like a veranda. And she had a stack of plates, and she was throwing them away from her, away from the house, like frisbees. And and it was really arresting, right? I mean, here's my mother destroying all the plates. And it was very disorienting what's happening. And then she finished throwing all the plates. They were all destroyed. And then she walked back in, and as though nothing odd had happened, she looked at me and she said, "How was your day?" And 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 we didn't talk about the plates at all. Like, we didn't talk about why she was throwing them, the fact that she just came in, flipped right on to nice mom, and as an adult, as a parent, as a woman, it was just really striking to me because, first of all, she was clearly angry, and in retrospect, she was angry at my dad. And but she did something that women often do, which is to get the anger, quote unquote, out of them. That model of anger in, anger out, but she did it in a way that women are inclined to, which is to take it out of the relationship. She didn't get angry at my father. She didn't threaten to break that relationship. She externalized it in a different direction. And in some ways, it really reminds me today of these stories of women in the United States who gathered in parks to have mass screams and
Pandemic screams. Yeah.
pandemic screams. And while I could understand it, I also thought, wait a minute, you're not actually changing the circumstances of your stress, of your resentment, of your anger, of your unwell feelings of being unwell. You're just going and screaming into a void together, which might give you a moment of satisfaction and solidarity, but doesn't actually alter the circumstances at all. And all of these women were very upfront about the stresses, the disproportionate housework, the disproportionate parenting. They just took it out of the relationship.
And I don't remember what we called it, right? It was in the pandemic. Was it a mom scream? Was it
Yeah,
a
a lot of
family
papers
scream?
called it the mom scream. Like, I remember the Washington Post. There was an article, and they interviewed me, and I honestly think initially when they interviewed me, they thought I'd be like, "Yeah, go out there, scream your rage out." And I'm like, No, no." But the lesson to me as a young woman, as a girl, was we don't talk about anger. We don't share it. I didn't share my anger. I didn't deal with it in a direct or healthier way that would elicit change. And it was more or less, anger is not for me. It's not for you.
Soraya Chemaly is the author of Rage Becomes Her, a Bahamian American author, activist, and feminist. She's written as a freelance journalist for The Atlantic, Time, The Guardian, Huffington Post, and Ms. Magazine, among others, on topics including freedom of expression, gender, women's rights, sexualized violence, media, and technology. She's also the director of the Women's Media Center Speech Project and has been named, among other things, one of Elle Magazine's 25 Most Inspiring Women to Follow on Twitter. Shamali's first book is titled Rage Becomes Her: The Power of Women's Anger. In the book, she examines the causes of female rage, the ways in which we are socialized to suppress it, and the psychological, sociological, biological, and political consequences of that paradigm. On today's podcast, we are focused on Rage Becomes Her. We talk about the day she came home from school to find her mother smashing every plate in the kitchen and then calmly asking about her day. We look at how failing to express our anger hurts us and who it helps. We dive deep into how we are still, sadly, teaching our kids to internalize the sense that women and girls' rights to our own anger are somehow less important than our responsibility to keep the peace. The title of the book is what got me because it is so elegant. Rage becomes her. I mean,
Well, it means many things.
kind of, but it could be a song. It should be on my coffee mug instead of Cape Cod or whatever I'm
Oh, that's
eating.
so
You know?
funny. Yeah.
Um, it grabbed my attention and immediately made me think back now in middle age
Right.
when I was a young private equity executive going
Mm-hmm.
hard on all the fronts.
Mm-hmm.
I remember taking so much pride in this phrase, which was Poonam wouldn't yell if she was on fire.
Yeah. Isn't that
And I was
funny?
rewarded. I was rewarded for never losing
Yes.
my
For being
cool.
unflappable, for never being
Unflappable,
angry.
and now I look
Mm-hmm.
back at it and it's sad because we realize so many of the things we did when we were younger no longer serve us, and how that had a ripple effect in the rest of our lives. Maybe we didn't
Mm-hmm.
yell in our marriages, maybe we didn't yell in our friendships, maybe when family wasn't, was letting us down, whatever it was. But, your book felt to me like it was less about women's rage and more about society's discomfort with women's extreme emotions in general,
Or
but
just
anger
women's
in particular.
needs.
Yes, women's
Just our
needs.
needs. This is the,
And
this is the thing about anger. It's not an extreme emotion. It's extreme when
right,
it
I
gets
shouldn't
to
have
the
said
point.
extreme.
Yeah, it's extreme when it gets to the point of destructive rage.
Right.
But if you're angry, it's usually for a good reason. You're like, what's
And why
going
did it
on?
get to rage? It maybe got to rage because
It
it's
got
been
to
stored.
rage. That's right. It got to rage because
So
it was unanswered.
and we ingest, you say this, right? You say we are socialized to either cry our anger out or swallow it
Hmm.
whole.
Right.
No wonder we're all beside ourselves. No wonder there's so much chronic illness for all of the
Hmm.
women in our generation. And we do have to take some ownership in that, right? But at the same time, we have to recognize the system. Can we start by defining rage?
Well, I mean, I think rage is ultimately a dysfunctional anger, right? It is the anger that has not been named, has not been addressed, has not been remediated. The whole point of anger is to eliminate itself, right? You get
Yeah.
angry so that something will change, so that you're no longer angry. If that cycle is completely divorced, as it is from femininity and girlhood, right? Like girls and boys all learn that anger is is the property of men. There's like anger is the masculine emotion, right? Unfortunately, the flip side of all, I sometimes joke that I could write this whole book with this similar research,
Mm,
gender flip it, and it would be boys and sadness.
mm.
Boys cannot feel sad, they can't feel anxious, they can't express fearfulness. Even empathy is broken out of some boys, right? And that's a not just bad for the boys, it's bad for the world, right? Like, but yeah, so the anger sort of really gets policed out of young girls, particularly in the United States, young black girls, brown girls. Um, White girls learn a different set of rules about anger, because they're not punished in the same ways socially, politically.
And you say anger gets policed out of the girls, sadness does get policed out of the boys. There's
Yeah.
someone else I interviewed on the podcast recently named Carlos Andres Gomez. He
Hmm.
wrote a book called Man Up,
Hmm. Yeah.
and he talks about a bar fight
Hmm.
where ultimately it's this beautiful story, but he's in New York City in Soho at a club, steps on someone's toe or something,
Hmm.
and immediately they're face to face.
So
He's like,
funny.
everyone around us is thinking, what's going to happen? Are they going
Hmm.
to kill each other? Are they just going to make out? What's going to happen? and then, and then he describes feeling his face was wet and a
Hmm.
tear was coming down.
Mm.
And that felt like a bomb went off. Everyone stopped. The fight was
Yeah.
over because
Yeah.
we can handle men's rage. We
Yeah.
can't handle their sadness.
What an
And
amazing
similarly
image.
with women. So
Yeah.
so it makes me think about the corollary of that. When did it start? Can you tell the story about your daughter in kindergarten?
Oh, yeah, that story. It's amazing. That story has really resonated with people. She was maybe two or three, and it was preschool, and there was this time before class, before the parents left, before school started, the kids were allowed to free play. And she always gravitated towards these giant building blocks, and for 10, 15 minutes she'd build a big structure, but she could decorate it with like ribbons and shiny things, and she just loved starting her day doing this. And every single day the same little boy would come in with his parents and knock it over. And what was really amazing was that he did it every day, and they didn't think to stop him. They were They just didn't stop him. And she was getting sad and frustrated and angry. And so I did all the things that I had been more or less socialized to do and think were good, right? So I tried to tell her, well, let's use your words and say to him, I'd really like you not to do that. That failed, right? Then body block, like just stand in the way. If he doesn't respect your words, then just don't allow him to physically do it. And that didn't work because it just became a scuffle. And she was getting angrier and angrier. And so I approached his parents and I was like, listen, they're trying to work it out, but honestly, he shouldn't be knocking it down every morning. And
Hmm.
their response was, boys will be boys. Look at how tempting that tower is. How can he resist? He can't control himself. And I'm standing there thinking, you are literally building a rapist.
Yeah,
And we're in
100%.
preschool and I can't say it like that,
Mhm.
but there are boundaries and she has the right to the space and she has the right to say no and she has the right not to be implicated in his lack of control or your lack of discipline or whatever it is. And yet in that time, like the teacher suggested maybe she could build in this other area. And I said,
Mm.
no, she's actually going to stay right here, which is
Mhm.
the building area,
Right.
right? Not the tearing down area. But all of us together as adults had participated and built a system in which he was defining the space, in which he defined the terms of engagement through his behavior, and in which there was no expectation from most of the adults that he could control himself. And a lot of people believe that young boys cannot control themselves. And cross-cultural studies actually show that that's just culture. It's parental
Mhm.
expectation, it's teacher expectations, it's cultural expectations. And so in some cultures, young boys at that stage have much more preschool school readiness because they have been expected to do what girls in this country are expected to do, which is control themselves. And
Mm.
yet there's just this prevailing sense that boys cannot do that. And so they're given this leeway. Um, and so that I think, it was very clear to me that her anger in that moment was not respected, not listened to. Her needs were not met by any of us. We were trying all these ways around the fact that he just couldn't be told, don't do that.
And she's being taught to scaffold his bad behavior.
100%. She's
She's
being
being taught to manage the
to
entire
adapt to his bad
environment
behavior.
and keep it
Yes.
calm, and he's being taught he's not expected to manage his own behavior. You know,
Or its effects on anybody. This is the other, like,
exactly.
the impact that it was having on him, on all of us, the energy going into navigating it. It was really something, I have to say.
So I was reading that portion of Rage Becomes Her, and there's another story that you tell in the book about being much much younger and hearing the story of your great grandmother and how the story goes that you were told
Mhm.
that she was 14 walking down the street and some handsome man rides up out of nowhere and picks her up and carries her off and they lived happily ever after. Meanwhile, being a 14-year-old girl yourself, you
Mm,
understood you wouldn't want to be kidnapped and then raped serially for the rest of your life by the man who kidnapped
pretty
you.
much,
Now, it
right?
was
Like,
a different time, but the fact that you knew early on you were not supposed to characterize it that way. That saying, well, actually, was great grandma, did she fall in love or was she kidnapped and serially raped?
yeah.
She was 14. The fact that you had the presence of mind to know that and to at least pick up on the fact that your environment was already training you, right? Your
Hmm.
first instinct was to say, this doesn't make sense. But there's this pause before you express that anger.
Hmm.
And I think every woman on the planet can
Yeah,
relate
and
to that pause. And I
for
wonder
sure.
when we learn to pause before we react. Too
Well,
soon.
in fact, I was 11 when that happened, and
11.
she was 14, but I was 11, and the reason that I had that sense was because already at that point I had had a good solid 2 years of very persistent street harassment. Like my experience of being a young girl was already one of navigating male violence in streets. And so it's a natural thing, right? I'm thinking, well, she was a young girl.
Mm.
if, as you said, if some man picked me up and took me halfway across the earth, never to see my family again, I don't think I'd be so happy with this story being turned into a fairy tale. But I think what happens is, even if you have that sense of justice and justice, a sense of self-worth ultimately, right? I had the great gift of being very loved by my family. And that gave me the ability to feel enough of a sense of self-worth and confidence to even think those things, to say those things. I was never threatened by physical violence, for example, which is not the case for vast numbers of children. And so, but even so, even though all of that was true, when I said that, or when I said things like that, it didn't have uptake. It's not like everyone was like, oh, yeah, you're right. It literally took 30 years for anyone in my family to say, you have a point,
Yeah. That narrative doesn't make sense. Hey, guess what?
right?
Logically, you're right.
Yeah. And so, but that point, that whole thing, like, it's really funny because even now I'm 58, and we have this big family thread. There's 35 of us on it. It's all the cousins, the aunts, the great uncles.
Love
And
it.
once in a while, someone will share a picture
Mhm.
that they've found or that they've seen of that generation of people at the turn of the last century. And the pictures are always just men because the women were not supposed to be photographed. And and people will say, "Oh, look at our family," and I'll be the one who's like, "Actually, it's just the men." No, these pictures were in what's now Jordan, but was not Jordan then,
Mhm.
right? It was,
Okay.
these are much older. But I think just having people develop an awareness of narrative imbalance, it
Mhm.
takes so long, and we're just socialized to not see it.
And I have to say that I was reading Rage Becomes Her right now, and my daughter's in pre-K.
Hmm.
And she comes home a couple weeks ago and she says there's some girl on the playground who hit her and pulled her hair. And I said, okay, well, what did you do? And she says, nothing. Well,
To
apparently,
you.
this is a pattern. It's been happening again
Yeah.
and again. So I was like, no, no, no,
No, no.
okay, I'm gonna have to tell you the same thing I told your brother at your age, which is we never hit first, we always hit back.
Hmm.
She said, "Oh, I'm gonna get in trouble." I said, "Does it matter if they're mad at you, or does it matter
Yeah.
if mommy picks you up and
Yeah.
takes you for ice cream? Because just so you know, for the rest of your life, when you
Yeah.
defend yourself, you get ice cream." Visceral for me. I went like,
Yeah.
she's 4. What else can I say?
Yeah.
But I knew where it went back in my head, which was a story my mother used to tell when we were younger. She, born and raised in India in a small
Yeah.
town. And it was and this boy comes riding around the corner on his bike, and as he's riding around the corner, he touched her
Mm.
and then laughed and kept going. Then he went all the way around the block, came back and did it again. And the third time he came around, she said she waited till he got really close, acted like she didn't know he was coming, and then grabbed him off of his bike by
Yeah.
his backpack and start screaming to her friend, hit him, hit him, hit him, hit him.
Yeah.
So these two girls are just beating the hell out of this
Yeah.
little boy on the corner. But because my mother, like you, was loved, she wasn't
Hmm.
going to not tell her daughter that story. And, you know, there are so many different vignettes and things in the book that I appreciate because they go back to the earliest possible stories we learn to tell ourselves about whether our anger is acceptable.
Hmm.
One quote I loved was anger shows how seriously we take ourselves. I mean that can be an anthem for people dealing with relationships. That can be
Hmm.
unequal pay, everything. It just I like do you think women when we are adults, are more afraid of expressing our anger or more afraid of our anger?
Well, it's hard, I think, to tease those out because, I was thinking of the story you told of your daughter and your mother, and I do write a lot about this. The problem is there are real penalties for expressing your anger, right? Like I described the same kind of street harassment your mother described when I was 15, and I punched a man in the throat because he grabbed my arm and spun me around to get a good look at me. The minute I punched him, I ran because I realized, wait a minute, he's going to attack me back now. I mean, I was defending myself, but there are
Mhm.
repercussions, right? And you don't even have to be angry if you're certain people for there to be repercussions. And so the studies I cite about young black girls in American schools is that if they're just assertive, if they're brazen, if they are rambunctious the way a young boy is, particularly a young white boy, they're much more likely to be suspended, disciplined, expelled. They're
Mhm.
not necessarily angry, right? Like we have a really hard time with girls and women separating assertiveness, aggression, and anger.
Mhm.
Those three things just get rolled up into one tight ball, and then we're just policed for any of them. Um, so there are real costs. And I think what happens to girls and women very often is that in realizing the costs, we disassociate from the emotion so that we don't risk it. And suppressing it, distorting it, it gets tessellated into all of these things in our bodies that hurt us. One of the reasons I wrote it was so that we could maybe have a language readers could recognize things so that it would stop being hurting them. We could all be healthier about recognizing how to name the anger, use the anger, address the anger, no matter what. You can decide what your level of risk is for yourself. You're like, well, I need to stay in this terrible marriage for this
Mhm.
following reason. What are the costs? What are the risks? But at least if you're thinking more clearly about it, maybe you can make better decisions as opposed to just being sick or full of rage.
Mm. And, you know, angry women are seen as difficult. Anger is a demand to hold the world accountable for its treatment of you.
Yeah.
Um, I keep going back to the pause. I keep going back to that. Women learn not to be reactive. How can we teach our daughters
I
not
mean, I
to
think our daughters are
pause?
going to teach us. I don't
I
have
love that.
I have no illusions at all. I think that young women should be mentoring older women. I really, truly, I mean, we have a responsibility as parents, but in fact, I think that they have a worldview shift. They have an experiential life that is radically different from ours. And you can see that in gender polarization in Gen Z. The girls really have been socialized to look to the future and to imagine new worlds. Boys,
Mm.
not so much. Boys are still being socialized to cling to the glory of the past and to models of masculinity that are completely not in sync with the world they live in, with the women that they are going to be competing with and living with.
And
It's a real
pursuing, yeah.
problem and pursuing, right? I mean, it's pretty much why 60% of Gen Z men are not dating,
I
but
know.
40% of Gen Z women are dating. And that's because large numbers of Gen Z women are simply refusing to deal with heteropatriarchal norms in their relationships. They're like, no, we don't need that.
And there is
And
statistics now
yeah,
about people not wanting children, not wanting to get married at all, the way that they
no.
look forward to it.
And also
It's a
gray
little
divorce,
sad.
it's even older, right? Gray
Yeah.
divorce is doubled in the last 10, 15 years. And that's mainly like 69% of divorces are initiated by women who don't go back into marriage. All the men are like, I'm getting married again. The women
Oh,
are like, no, 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 I'm not doing that.
first.
I'm looking for peace. I'm looking for freedom. And I think what women are saying is there's literally too much of an element of servitude in this construction of marriage. That's why so many movements are sort of focused on what I would say are middle class, upper middle class chore wars, right?
Mhm, Sure wars.
Chore wars.
And when you think about it, when you think about marriage, the future of hetero, traditional quote unquote marriage,
Hmm.
if
Hmm.
we can get society somehow magically to a point where in the next 10 years or so, women are comfortable to express their rage, at least within the context of those relationships, do you think there is a future for that type of marriage? Or do you think it's just a whole renegotiation of the way people can handle each other in hetero relationships? Because if we agree that we've been living in a world where men's anger is acceptable and women's anger is to be swallowed, then of course once women had the wherewithal to leave marriage, they would.
I mean, I think it has a lot, I think it hinges on what direction masculinity goes
Mhm.
in. I mean, half the country is running for the 19th century man,
Yeah.
right? They're just running in the opposite direction. And their ideal of a man is a provider and protector, which is fine if women are vulnerable. It's fine if women are, and I say vulnerable in the sense that it's a socially constructed state. You cannot earn your own living. You don't live in a society that will ensure your safety. Like, that's the whole provide and protect model of masculinity. It requires women's vulnerability, right?
Mhm, mhm,
And that was one model for marriage for a very long time. But there's another model, which is partnership. And if we can construct masculinity around that notion of empathetic, mutual respect and partnership, then it's fine. It doesn't mean it's not without its issues, but it's a completely different vision of what two people living together, regardless of their sexual orientation, regardless of their gender, how they choose to live with one another. And it's not, it is literally a situation in which people, I don't want to, I want to be careful with my words, but in some ways, the people become interchangeable in terms of their roles,
mhm,
right?
mhm.
Everybody is capable of doing the things
The
and
things.
the things, all the things. Everybody's capable of doing the things, and everybody is enriched by that as opposed to feeling depleted. Like, too many men cannot live with the knowledge that their spouses make more money.
Hmm.
They just can't, they cannot reconcile
Yeah.
it with their sense of manhood because they feel like failures. A husband is 5 times more likely to cheat on his wife if she makes more money. That's just male fragility,
Mhm,
right? And so why would we continue to socialize boys in a way that means they cannot fairly compete with women on a
mhm.
level playing field? And that's what we're doing.
And
Gen Z
part of it
boys
is
definitely
part of
feel
it is
that
we're
it's not a
saying
level playing
men.
field.
Yeah, and we're saying men versus women, but what we should be saying is masculinity and femininity because it's understood that men can have masculine and feminine traits, women can
It's
have
not
masculine.
understood, though. You and
I
I
mean,
understand
in
it.
educated circles, right? You and I understand it.
Yeah.
I interviewed someone else on the podcast a couple weeks ago, Neil Sheminsky. He's
Hmm.
known as Professor Neil on
Oh,
TikTok.
yes, yes,
And he's all about gender studies,
for
right?
sure.
We were talking about mixed messaging in masculinity and the
Hmm.
manosphere. I asked him, okay, so what's your definition of masculinity? And everything he described was just being a good person. And I was like, that
Yeah,
doesn't help me. That doesn't help me, dude. And he was like, well, why? Why can't that be the definition of masculinity? I
yeah.
said, because we're not that far along yet. To me, healthy traditional masculinity is three things. It's what boys were raised to be, my father. It's I keep my word. I protect those I love.
But
I
that you
stand
can do
for
that as a woman, though.
you could, but there is an element to those three things tied together that feel, to me, beautifully masculine in a way that doesn't threaten femininity and doesn't say you can't also be nurturing and all the other things. It's
Hmm.
not incompatible. But I think we need to get back to a place where we elevate pieces of masculinity
Hmm.
and see them for the beauty that they are, and elevate pieces of femininity and see them for the beauty that they are, and don't talk about men versus women as much as masculinity versus
Well, I mean, I
femininity.
think I think a lot of people's use of the terms, which I think you're talking about as masculine virtues.
Hmm, hmm.
You probably have a lot of what you think of as masculine virtues.
Oh, for sure. Mhm.
I do too. But then the question is, what makes them masculine?
Right. Society's
Like,
told us the story.
what makes them masculine? Uh, you
Yeah.
know, And that's really unsettling to people because the superstructure of our societal organization is binary sex segregation. And
Mm.
yet we're living in an era of fluidity, acceleration, rapid and radical change. We understand things more relationally, maybe some of us, than atomistically. I mean, there are all of these sociocultural changes in the air that affect our sense of self and how we relate to others. And so I think I'm more resistant to that idea than you are, that the idea of gendered virtues. Because the only
Well,
reason they're gendered is because we have this legacy,
yeah.
this very rich global legacy, I will add.
And another way to put it is this. When you think about the transition of middle age for an individual, you're going from I was in survival mode to stop, take stock, do the coping mechanisms that I
Yeah, you're
developed
doing.
still serve me? And if they don't serve me, I want to be different now.
Mhm.
Maybe society is in its middle age of thinking about gender and norms, because
Mhm.
the reason girls went into survival mode was because as children it served us
Right.
to say we wouldn't scream if we were on fire. Now in middle age that no longer serves us, and so we need to learn to retrain ourselves.